Every season brings new excitement to the Formula One world, whether that's through new teams, new drivers, new rivalries, or new rules. We haven't got any new teams this season, but we have plenty of the other three. You all know about Ocon versus Gasly by now. We'll learn about the new drivers as the season goes on. But there are plenty of new rules that you might not be aware of that you should definitely know, so stick around to get up to date before the start of the new season. The tyres teams use have a huge impact on the competitiveness of the car. Sure, they're all using the same tyres, but some teams use them better than others, and sometimes the tyres are just completely unusable. We saw this with the hardest compound tyres in 2022, but Pirelli have plans to change this. There are also going to be changes to the rules around tyres for the teams. A revised qualifying format, RQF for short, will take place at up to 2 events in 2023, for the aim of assessing whether the adjustments are acceptable for succeeding championships. Basically, 2 trial runs before implementing the format in every race. The RQF will require teams to fit specific tyres to their cars for each session. Hard tyres only in Q1, medium tyres only in Q2, and soft tyres only in Q3. Intermediates and wet will be allowed if the RQF sessions are declared wet, of course. The idea behind this is to decrease the amount of tyres given to each team over the weekend by taking away 2 sets of softs. Teams will normally use soft tyres through the whole qualifying session. For the RQF event, each driver can use no more than 11 sets of dry weather tyres, 4 sets of intermediate tyres and 3 sets of wet weather tyres. This contrasts with the standard weekend allotment of 13 sets of dry weather, 4 sets of intermediate and 3 sets of wet weather tyres. That isn't the only tyre change coming. From the 6th race of the 2023 Formula One season at Imola in April, a new Pirelli wet weather tyre that does not require tyre blanket heating will be deployed. Wet tyres do get heated in tyre blankets at the moment, but by the time the car is at the end of the pit lane in cold weather, the tyres have lost all that heat anyway. So a tyre that performs well without heating will save the huge amount of energy used heating the tyres and should reduce the time it takes for wet tyres to get working. An F1 and FIA joint statement said that, following successful testing by Pirelli, with the support of teams, Pirelli have arrived at a wet weather tyre, which is much more performant than the previous specification. This tyre type does not require the use of blankets. The new standard was established following special wet weather test sessions conducted by many teams over the winter, and it was initially intended for 2024, when covers for both wet and dry tyres are due to be prohibited. The tests were so successful that the tyres have been brought forward. Wet conditions, particularly the visibility, have been a big discussion topic in recent years, following a number of races that have been ruined by rain, most notably the 2021 Belgian Grand Prix. That notorious Grand Prix awarded points despite only 2 laps happening behind a safety car. That wasn't the worst part though. Spectators weren't given refunds, something that normally happens when a race is called off, because the 2 laps counted as a completed race. That must have been gutting. Luckily, there is a plan to stop this from happening next season. During wet weather, cars will be fitted with spray-reducing wheel arches, which will be tested on track in the middle of this season. The FIA has performed its own CFD study, but the teams have now been granted the formal green light to conduct wind tunnel and CFD work on the impact of the arches, outside of both the aerodynamic testing constraints and the cost cap. Nicholas Tombazis, the new FIA single-seater director, provided some insight into the project. "We only think it's going to be something that gets used on a couple of occasions a year, maybe 3, that sort of thing," he said. "We don't want it to be that every time there's a drop of rain, then suddenly you have to fit these things. We've done a lot of CFD simulations because we want to make sure the effect of these devices is relatively small on the overall aerodynamics. There is still an effect, but not a massive one. Once we have a solution, we'll get to do some prototypes and run them on some cars to try and evaluate that properly. Hopefully the new wet weather wheel arches will see an end of hour-long waits for race starts and a return of wet weather racing. Improving visibility for the drivers in wet conditions is also a massive positive, and we are all for it." So what else is going to be changing for the 2023 season? Well, during the first year of the new generation of cars, it was universally agreed that DRS passes were too easy at some venues, while zones were too short at others. As great as it is seeing cars pass each other, we don't want it to be happening at the exact same spot on every lap, because of the advantage DRS gives. After thoroughly scrutinizing last season's statistics, the FIA has disclosed that changes would be made at the Bahrain, Jeddah, Melbourne, Baku and Miami circuits to help balance things out. The full list of changes hasn't been released yet, but we do know that Melbourne will gain a 4th DRS zone to assist closing cars down. It isn't just the DRS zones that are changing though. The FIA has confirmed that resurfacing work is being carried out in Baku and Miami. Baku gave a bumpier ride than a bouncy castle and was the breaking point in the porpoising debate last season. Street circuits are always a little worse than bespoke tracks, but Baku was unbearably bad by all accounts. The tarmac in Miami just wasn't suitable for Formula 1 cars' rubber, so the whole car park at the Hard Rock Stadium is being resurfaced, so it's more like a racetrack and less like, well, what it is, a car park. The changes go beyond tracks and tyres. There are changes to the sporting regs as well. There is the rule about drivers making political statements, which has had plenty of coverage already, but there are other changes as well. During a recent meeting of the F1 Commission in London, it was also agreed that restrictions limiting what radio signals may be transmitted between drivers and teams will be eased going forward. Some years ago, there was a crackdown to prevent teams from overcoaching drivers. There will also be changes to parc fermé rules in the sporting regs. During sprint race weekends, team will have more leeway to replace parts that are regularly broken, and self-declared forms from the teams will be used more to better police themselves. The list of changes goes on and on. The phrasing of regulations governing the distribution and points for abbreviated races, which created controversy during last year's Japanese Grand Prix, has also been revised. The changes will guarantee that full points are only granted for races that run close to their entire extent, while limited points will be issued if events are cut short or cannot run their full distance due to interruptions. This will stop a situation like last year happening, when Max won the driver's title in Japan, but no one had a clue that it had happened. Remember that anticlimax? Yeah, let's avoid a repeat of that, please. Speaking of rules that made a mess last year, let's talk grid penalties. They were highlighted at last year's Italian Grand Prix when several drivers took power unit and gearbox-related drops and flipped the order. No one had a clue what the starting grid was going to be for Sunday, and even the race directors seemed to have no idea. It took hours to publish a finalized starting grid after qualifying finished. The relevant section now reads, classified drivers who have accrued more than 15 cumulative grid position penalties or who have been penalized to start at the back of the grid will start behind any other classified driver. Their relative position will be determined in accordance with their qualifying classification. Simple. There is a change to the financial regulations as well. The added budget for each Grand Prix above the 21 race limit has now been upped from $1.2 million to $1.8 million. This was done because the extra events were often flyaways that were more expensive than races in Europe. There are also a few technical regulation changes outside the much spoken about porpoising changes. As we enter the new season, the minimum weight of cars without fuel is dropping to 796 kilograms, 2 kilograms less than last season. The rear view mirrors on F1's 2023 spec cars will be changed to boost driver visibility, with the width of the reflecting surface expanding by 50mm, from 150mm to 200. There are also changes to gearboxes, kind of. While changes to homologated gearboxes were only previously permitted to resolve reliability problems, or for cost saving at the start of each season, modifications are now permitted in case of materials, processes, or proprietary parts becoming unavailable. Basically, if materials become unavailable due to a global shipping crisis like during COVID, teams can make changes, which is sensible. You can't drive without a gearbox after all. And finally, for 2023, fuel in a car can't be cooler than 10 degrees Celsius below ambient temperature, or 10 degrees Celsius at any time after leaving the garage. Whew, we got there. Did you take notes? Because this is all going to come up at some point during the season. Now, you can take to social media and correct people who don't know the new rules. Have fun! But before you go, don't forget to subscribe to get all the news during the 2023 season. Until next time, drive safe and bye for now.